Hi, my name is Lisa Cook, and I'm the GRC Practice Principal here at ISACA. Welcome to another podcast given by ISACA. Today we have with us Yakir Golan, and he wrote an informative article in January of 2025, this year, on Cyberrisk Quantification, a strategic imperative for financial resilience. Welcome, Yakir.
Thank you, Lisa. True pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite.
Great. Well, before we dive into your article, let's introduce you to our audience. Can you tell us a bit of your background? How did you get into this line of work, your education path, and what you do now professionally?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll try not to keep it too long. So I started my career as you anticipate, as many cyber entrepreneurs from Israel in the intelligence forces, where I was immersed in cybersecurity operations from a very technical and strategic perspectives. After the service, I pursued the B-Science and Electrical Engineer from the Technion. That's like the Israeli MIT. And after that, I completed my MBA abroad in IE Business School in Madrid, Spain. Years followed, I held variety of diverse roles in the tech industry, from software and hardware development through product management, marketing, and business development. And it gave me a holistic view of how business in tech, in cybersecurity industries function globally. In that time, I became interested in how organizations can enhance their cyber resilience by optimizing the way they allocate resources and optimally how they can make better decisions, smarter decisions in the more strategic investments in cybersecurity. And that's what got me into the thinking of how can I help them achieve that. I started exploring across the board. I got introduced into the world of financial models as a central to decision making in more mature disciplines than cybersecurity. And I realized this is it. This is exactly what's needed in cybersecurity. And that's what got me back in the days, 2017, to start the company, and thinking that financial modeling can help organizations prioritize cybersecurity initiatives more effectively, but moreover, and not less important, help executives across the board communicate at board levels, at executive levels in a way that is more clear, in a way that is more business oriented, not just technical. And that's what led us to start the company, to build a platform where we were thinking how we can digest and transform all this massive amount of cyber intelligence and cyber data into financially meaningful cyber risk insights. And from day one, we knew that in order to distinguish ourselves in the market, we must have the best models, meaning the ones that are most accurate and most precise. And for that, we decided strategically to start with a focus on the insurance industry, where we could build robust, defensible models and in the same time develop unique access to data from the insurance industry. And that gave us indeed a privileged access to rich detailed cyber loss data. And from there, it was clear for us the way forward to get to the point that we will receive fantastic feedback from those clients, big insurance groups. It just took us a bit longer than we thought. It turns out that developing robust, scalable risk models in cyber is a tough task, a multi-layer challenge, and it took us more than 4 years to get to that point that these clients, some of the biggest insurance groups in the world, told us, guys and ladies, you're onto something. And it was 2022 when we got this feedback, and then we went full throttle to the enterprise space, supporting directly the corporates directly, and mostly chief information security officers. And then since then, that's the core focus of the company. And we continuously, and specifically myself, I'm focused on how we bring continuous value and superior value to our clients while having the best models in the industry.
Yeah. I think that cyber risk quantification is a very, very interesting topic. And to help our audience better understand, can you explain the concept of cyber risk quantification and its significance in today's cybersecurity landscape?
Yeah, I'll definitely can try. So Cyberrisk Quantification, or as one is telling in abbreviation CRQ, is essentially the process of evaluating organizations' cyber exposure using advanced statistical models to express the potential loss scenarios in financial terms. So I'll try to give a simple basic example. A CRQ assessment might eliminate that organization face a 20% annual likelihood of suffering a ransomware event that on average will cost $15 million. And in translating the way cyber risk traditionally been communicated in more qualitative metrics, CRQ offer much higher level of clarity to stakeholders to better understand what's their operational and financial vulnerabilities due to their digital activity. And moreover, if we're thinking about the advanced solution CRQ, what's called, I love to call on-demand CRQ solutions, the ones that we offer in Kovrr, we are specifically defined by the ability to automatically account for organization current cybersecurity posture, tech stack, and its unique business processes. And when leveraging extensive external intelligence and combining with crucial internal data, on-demand CRQ rapidly produces an objective, accurate, real-time view of the entire spectrum of losses an enterprise may face in a top-down approach, helping to understand what's the potential magnitude and likelihood of these events. And in short, CRQ bridges the divide that too often exists between cybersecurity and more traditional risk management environments. And this typically is what's exactly needed in today's market as regulator tighten and cybersecurity incidents grow and become more costly. Stakeholders need a data-driven means of managing the cyber risk. Managing cybersecurity leaders have to be able to communicate in a broader business terms. And that's exactly where CRQ is playing. And they have to be in a position they are able to say, here how much risk we are carrying. Here is how much how much we are exposed, and this is what we can do to reduce it, and backed it up with actual financial numbers. This is the clarity that CRQ brings to the table.
Excellent, excellent. And we talked about earlier, I gave the title of the written piece that you did for us in January, Cyberrisk Quantification, a strategic imperative for financial resilience. You've given us a sense of what CRQ is. Can you talk more about that and let us know who is likely to be accountable and responsible for its execution? Who are the key stakeholders?
So the article breaks down CRQ as a method for understanding organization cyber exposure in terms that business leaders can actually understand, allowing them to take an action. It takes risk conversation from, for instance, the realm of technical scores or other subjective measurements into objective financial insights. Instead of needing to say this cyber loss scenario is severe, you can say this scenario could cost us $23 million and has a 17% likelihood of occurring this year. But just as important as the output is also who involved in making the CRQ process as effective as it can be. The CISO or respective cybersecurity leader is often the one driving the CRQ assessment, and of course the respective teams, leading the data gathering process, ensuring it accurately reflects the organization's digital infrastructure. But when I'm thinking about what you're asking, ultimately it is a shared effort and requires the participation of executive shareholders across departments. So the CISO should not be operating in isolation. The CFO, the Chief Risk Officer, the CTO, the GRC leaders, and even the legal and compliance team should all be engaged at some point or another, whether it's to help interpret financial exposure, integrate technological findings during the setup process, and ensure that the company's security, maturity, and regulation posture is up to date and up to standard, or align a risk insight into the broader governance objectives. And the board, of course, can harness the ensuring outputs to guide the strategy, making crucial governance decisions and set risk appetite levels. So while it's the CRQ that leading the process, CRQ can only deliver the maximum impact that is required when it becomes a shared effort, in my perspective.
Oh, excellent. You mentioned a number of stakeholders, CISOs in particular. In conducting the cyber risk assessment, what is the role of the CISO, and what steps can the CISO take to ensure the evaluations are both accurate and actionable?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa. So when it comes to Cyberrisk quantification, the accuracy of the output is highly dependent on the input of the data. The CISO knows this better than anyone else. If the input data isn't current, reliable, objective, or reflective to the organization's actual risk environment, the entire assessment is in jeopardy. It can be skewed and, even worse, lead to ineffective risk management strategies and decisions. So one of the most important things a CISO can do is to ensure there's transparency into what data is being used, where it's coming from, and how it's being fed into the model, and how it's impacting the outputs, the exact parameters. That's why choosing the right CRQ approach matters so much. Models that rely heavily on expert judgment or spreadsheets struggle with consistency and scale. They're also time-consuming and subjective, which leads to obsolete results till you're finishing the exercise. On-demand CRQ models, by contrast, continuously ingest internal data like asset inventory or data from endpoints, vulnerability management solutions, and layer it with external objective threat intelligence and business intelligence data at actuarial grade loss data. And that's giving you fast, statistically sound output that you can actually use. From there, it's not just about the model running the background. Ensuring the accuracy and actionability also means that the CISO needs to bring in colleagues from across the organization, as mentioned in the previous question. Early in the quantification iteration, the CISO should work with different department heads, like those from IT and finance and compliance and legal, and make sure the model reflects how the business really works. But no matter how accurate and precise the results are, they're only useful when they are communicated clearly. So the CISO needs to be ready, either by doing it on his or her own, or using a platform that does it for him or her, to translate those numbers into insights leadership can actually use. Like, here's how much financial exposure we have. This is the ROI on potential specific risk reduction activity that we are planning. And with that, we'll reduce the exposure by 15%. And it's aligned to our risk appetite levels that we define in the annual board meeting in Q1. The bottom line is that the CISO chooses the right model, and if he chooses the right model and the right people, CRQ becomes a really powerful tool to help stakeholders across the board in the business to make smarter decisions around cybersecurity.
Okay, excellent. And you talked about risk appetite, and that got me thinking a little bit about these models. What factors should organizations consider to ensure it aligns with their specific needs and risk profiles, those CRQ models?
One of the most important factors to consider when you think about choosing a CRQ model that is the underlying methodology, and whether it's been validated at scale. All right? So a model that hasn't been tested across a diverse set of organization contexts and real-world loss data that can quickly lead to misleading outputs and low stakeholder confidence. Of course, I can give the testimonial for Kovrr. We've been validated and calibrated, and this is why we're getting some fantastic success and momentum. We've been validated and calibrated across millions of companies using the combination of proprietary insurance claims data, cyber event data, threat intelligence, and company-specific characteristics. And that's what put us in a very unique spotlight. And this level of validation is exactly what makes a models capable of delivering consistent and accurate results at scale that is needed for enterprises. And it means that the outputs aren't based on generic assumptions, that they instead directly reflect how different kinds of companies actually experience cyber risk, making them far more useful when it comes to setting risk appetite level or justifying a specific investment decision or decisions. I'll try to think about another angle. So if you think about another factor to consider is how well the CRQ model can handle complexity. So some organizations, they just need a basic way to frame cyber risk in financial terms, but others, and we see more and more in enterprises in this color, especially large enterprises, or big holding firms that are using and managing multiple entities, they need a model that can support detailed portfolio level analysis. So the model has to be able to scale along with this specific use case. Moreover, the speed and usability matter as well. If it takes 3 months to set up and operationalize it, or it requires a team of analysts just to run one simulation and to interpret the results, as it in the case in some approaches, that's not sustainable. That's not sustainable and not doable for big enterprises. A robust model is one that delivers accurate insights quickly. I won't say on the spot, but quickly. And this is intuitive enough for a risk manager or a GRC leader to use it and justify and explain it without heavy support behind it. And finally, there is the angle of data transparency. So cybersecurity leaders and the rest of the executive team, they need to know and they demand to know what's driving the results. And in fact, this is one of the main questions we get in Kovrr day and night. How are the outputs being generated? What's behind the results? So if the methodology is a black box, these outputs can be clearly explained, the model definitely loses its value. And when it's the other side around, this is where you're getting a lot of credit with your clients, with your partners, and in general in the market. And to summarize, ultimately choosing the right CRQ solution boils down to making sure that the model has the ability to reflect one's organization real exposure, can scale according to the needs, and produce actionable, reliable results that can stand out for scrutiny at the board level.
Okay, excellent. Well, in your article, you talk about on-demand models and you compare and contrast that with expert judgment. Can you discuss the potential pitfalls of relying solely on expert judgment for cyber risk assessments?
Yeah, for sure. So expert judgment models definitely have their place, I have to say, but relying on them exclusively for Cyberrisk Quantification have some serious drawbacks. So for starters, they're inherently subjective. You're essentially asking a person or a small group of people to estimate a cyber risk scenario and potential losses based on their experience. While it has value, it is valuable, it's also inconsistent and hard to scale. And two different experts could look at the same scenario and form two completely different conclusions. Then there is the issue of speed and sustainability. Expert-driven models are generally built on manual processes, which means getting to outputs means all relevant stakeholders needs to be convened, walk through all the scenarios into the data and align all severity rating. And it's a long, drawn-out process. By the time you complete the assessment, the cyber threat landscape in general and for the organization is most likely already changed. So you're now making crucial decisions based on obsolete outcomes. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, as cyber risk management becomes more integrated into the higher level of the organization, expert judgment models can be really hard to defend. If a board member or regulator asks, where these numbers came from, it's nearly impossible to provide a robust, solid answer when the process was based on subjective workshop rather than validated model with clear data sources and methodologies. This is in contrast is where on-demand models emerge as particularly advantages across the board. They've built to continuously ingest both internal and external data and produce outputs that are current, repeatable, and clearly explainable at the board and regulatory level. And honestly, as regulatory scrutiny keeps growing and executive accountability reaches all-time high, that kind of defensibility is no more or less than essential and a must.
Excellent, excellent. So we've done our assessment and now we're ready to communicate our findings. What are some best practices for communicating CRQ findings to C-suite executives and board members to facilitate informed decision-making?
Mm-hmm. So boards and executive leaders have always been accountable for the organization's overall risk posture. But for a long time, cybersecurity wasn't treated as a strategic business risk, and boards weren't expected to give it significant attention. In fact, it was largely seen as a technical issue handled by the IT team, and that's completely changed now, already changed. In the past, I would say roughly 3 years, cyber has become a consistent topic at board level. And stakeholders are not only expecting regular updates, they want those updates delivered in a language they tangibly understand, one that helps them make proactive decisions about enterprise exposure and investments. So if you're trying to communicate your organization's cyber risk exposure on the value of your cyber program, the key is to make sure you're not throwing around technical jargon and abstract risk metrics as commonly used for many years. You really have to get to the core of how that particular risk or achievement impacts the business, such as financial operational losses. This is why CRQ is such a powerful tool for organization and specifically enterprises. And because with CRQ, all of a sudden can go from we currently face X number of vulnerabilities, which means we need X million dollars to patch them as soon as possible, to something that is, let's call it more precise. We face 12% annual likelihood of experiencing this type of incidents, which on average will cost the organization $21 million. Therefore, we need additional $5.5 million to mitigate this exposure to align to the level of risk appetite that we defined together in the beginning of the year or 2 years ago, depends on the organization. That type of reframing makes cyber risk management all the more tangible and all more likely to be given the necessary resource, support, and attention, because stakeholders can see what their investments are achieving. And that's a mind shift in cybersecurity. You also have to be strategic about how you present those numbers, and effective communication depends on speaking directly to your audience in the language they understand. So if you're speaking to a board member with a legal background, you might want to highlight the penalties and fines that could be incurred if a certain control hasn't reached an adequate maturity level. If you're talking to someone with financial experience, then it might be better to emphasize the ROI on your cyber risk mitigation strategy. And this is huge to not just show the risk the organization face, but also demonstrate what you're doing about it and why. And as I said, highlighting the ROI of specific controls, upgrades, or new solution that are being deployed is key. And if you can show that your security program is directly reducing potential monetary losses and bolstering resilience, then you've become a facilitator of the business goal and not just a line item.
Right. Well, in talking about communication, it really got me thinking a little bit about materiality. I'm sure around the globe, there are various requirements for regulatory and governmental reporting. Here in the United States, the SEC requires publicly traded companies to disclose cyber incidents in their 8K. How can CRQ help organizations determine materiality for reporting cybersecurity, or how are enterprises using CRQ to determine materiality, which triggers when and what needs to be disclosed in regulatory findings or filings?
Yeah, so definitely it's a good driver for business. I can say not funny, but interestingly enough, it brought a lot of private companies that also looking on the public sector and saying we understand the value of this, and they came and asked to utilize CRQ for this kind of analysis, which is very interesting. But specifically to what you're asking, so after the SEC finals its July 2023 cybersecurity regulation, there was a lot of confusion and debate, much of which is still ongoing in regard to how to define materiality. The SEC uses the legal precedent of reasonable investor thresholds, but it still leaves a lot of uncertainty about what would qualify for disclosure and why. And you can actually see this confusion in a lot of the early filings. Some organizations were even reporting events that they specifically did not yet deemed to be considered material because they didn't have the structured way to determine materiality. but still wanted to demonstrate to the SEC that they were being transparent. This ambiguity is exactly why CRQ emerges as so valuable for that. It gives organizations the ability to establish quantified, predefined loss threshold for financial damages. For example, including a loss of 1% of annual revenue or outage hours and so forth. And this benchmark certainly don't override or negate any qualitative judgment that needs to be included in the materiality decision-making process. What it does, it gives stakeholders a very concrete starting point, which makes decision-making not only more efficient, but also more defensible. And these benchmarks aren't just random suggestions. Setting them up aligns directly with what the SEC has explicitly encouraged. If you take a look at their commentary, one of the most definitive directions they've made to clarify the issue is to tell registrants to consider the impact of financial conditions and results of operations, both of which are clearly quantifiable. So now with CRQ, instead of relying on internal debates or vague severity scales, companies can say something like, according to our modeled exposure and internally set loss benchmark, this event is not considered material. Plus, here's the data we have to support the call. This reporting structure support both form of 8K compliance, in which you need to disclose without unreasonable delay, and form 10K, in which you have to describe your internal processes for assessing material cyber risk. And I want to reiterate, because I received so many pushbacks on this already, CRQ does not replace qualitative analysis. Qualitative factors are extremely important to consider for materiality. What CRQ does do, however, it gives you a strong, repeatable foundation, so you're not making these critical decisions from scratch every day. In fact, once you have those quantitative benchmarks in place, it becomes much easier to focus on those more qualitative impact factors like reputational fallouts, for example. And at the end of the day, CRQ brings the structure that organizations need to assess and manage material risk and events in a way that aligns with business reality and regulatory expectations.
Excellent. Excellent. And, it gets me thinking, when you talk about events, it gets me thinking a little bit about cyber insurance. How would CRQ techniques help enterprises determine adequate cyber insurance coverage?
Yeah, that's a fantastic angle. So last year, a study found that cyber insurance rates were leveling out, but the market is still very much maturing. And unfortunately, in what we see in a lot of cases, policies are still aren't well aligned with companies' actual exposure. The two main issues we generally see are that companies are either underinsured, meaning their losses exceed policy limits, or two, they're overpaying for coverage that doesn't really match the expected loss scenario they are likely to face. And what CRQ does is give organizations a data-driven view by a third party into which types of these loss scenarios they're most likely to face. It could be ransomware, it could be an extortion, it could be business interruption, it could be regulatory compliance issues, and other stuff like that. It illuminates what the financial impact of those scenarios might be. And with CRQ, this visibility typically is delivered through a loss experience curve, which shows the likelihood of experiencing this kind of losses in different financial levels. So then organizations are equipped to negotiate their policy terms based on direct information, such as the probability of exceeding a deductible or sublimit. And instead of, I'll try to put it in color, so instead of using generic industry benchmarks, CISO can determinedly say that, for example, there is a 3% chance that a ransomware event will exceed the $5 million deductible, but a whooping 28% chance that the business interruption will. So maybe we'll shift coverage towards the layer scenario. So it's just helping you to find the, I would say, fit for purpose coverage for your specific risk profile. And quantitative modeling also help to ensure that the organization, they lock in terms that are proportional to their exposure. They're not overpaying or left with gaps when things go wrong, and it does sometimes. And one real example I can share from the Kovrr universe is we worked with a U.S. Private equity firm that used the platform to do exactly that across portfolio, 50 companies. We assess each portfolio's cyber exposure, and of course group that in a portfolio level analysis as well, and help them to negotiate a bulk insurance deal with the broker, and ended with cross portfolio reduction of 70% on average. And that's when you think about and talking about that scale, that's real. Probably I can say millions of dollars that we saved the PE across the portfolio, and yeah, equally as important, they walk away with coverage that actually reflected their environment, and not a coverage that is aligned to a benchmark in the industry or something like that. Direct fit to each and every portfolio risk profile, which is what you should have with your coverage.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, in the little bit of time that we have left, let's get our crystal ball out and look ahead. What trends do you foresee in the field of cyber risk quantification, and how should organizations prepare for these developments?
Sure. So one of the biggest shift we're seeing is I believe it's only going to accelerate is how CRQ is transforming the cyber GRC space in general, from what used to be a checkbox expertise into a concrete strategic driver. There's a prevalent misconception that GRC is just about compliance. Like, did we tick the right box? Do we have the security control in place? Do we have a policy for that? And fortunately, the mindset is changing fast, especially as the cost of cyber exposure becomes more and more apparent and severe. Stakeholders are starting to realize that with a robust cyber GRC program, they can actually reduce their organization's financial exposure and even improve how well the business performs. And of course, there has to be a way to measure this performance, which is why CRQ has emerged as a real facilitator in the GRC space. And with CRQ, managers and GRC-powered CRQ platforms enable managers not just tracking generic high-low likelihood items in a spreadsheet. They actually quantify each potential loss scenario and determine precisely how likely it is, how much it would cost, what's the magnitude if it is materialized, and which specific controls can reduce the exposure at most. So now GRC leaders can walk into high-level strategic meetings and confidently say that their programs will reduce average annual loss, for example, by 33% this year, or they can say that a certain control upgrade will deliver a positive ROI within 12 months. This kind of tangible insights really transform the way cyber GRC is perceived. If I'm taking it back to the early days of why we started Kovrr, this is exactly why we started the company, and making it relevant to across the board for business leader, whether they are from cyber or finance or legal, to align around the business strategy of the organization through the cybersecurity initiatives. And we're seeing customers use CRQ to evaluate the regulatory risk exposure and demonstrate how much they are saving in potential fines while proactively addressing certain compliance gap with CRQ. So the benefits are very measurable. And to finish, looking ahead, I think that the future of CRQ is about embedding directly into how cyber risk is not only managed, but also governed. So it's not only a modeling tool, it's becoming the backbone of a modern, board-ready cyber GRC program.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I want to thank you, Yakir, for such an informative discussion about CRQ, and I hope our audience will go out and check out your article on that. Such great insights. That's all we have time for right now, and I just want to thank you again for joining us, and thank all our listeners and our viewers for tuning into another ISACA podcast. Have a great day.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all the listeners for taking the time to listen in. And if you have any interest to exchange thoughts about the topic, don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you.